My name's Gwen Diagram. I'm talking about how to win with automation and influence people. It's amazing to be here. This is my first dev conference. I'm a tester and a Scrum Master and an automation kid. So, little bit about me. I currently work at Sky. I accidentally became the test manager. I'm an automation tester. I don't give a fuck about test management. But that happens to all of us. We end up becoming managers. So, I'm really into dinosaurs, whether they're living or dead. That includes pigeons, because they're living dinosaurs. And I organise a conference up in Leeds called the Leeds Testing Atelier, which is a one-day free punk rock testing conference. So we have like people speaking from all different disciplines. So DBAs talking about unit testing. Don't care as long as it's testing, testing related. So it's kind of, although we have a lot of testers coming, we get developers coming and stuff like that as well. So currently I'm working in a Java space, but my first love was C#. I still really miss C#, but allow it, you end up working in Java. So this is a journey about implementing a test framework at my current place of work, which is Sky in Leeds. I work in a huge team. So there's about 60 people in my team. And Sky itself is fucking 30,000 people or something. It's huge. So I'm not used to working in a really big company like this. I've worked in startups previously and generally smaller companies. So companies that totally weren't mammoths. So here's my story of learning how to work in a really massive company. So as it usually starts, it started off with an interview. So at the time there was another senior tester, so I interviewed with him and the principal engineer. So in the interview, I asked what automation frameworks were being used because, you know, I'm going to have to actually work on these. So frameworks included Spock, Scala Test, Thucydides. It's taken me so long to learn how to say that. When you name a framework, name it something that people can fucking say. JBehave, JUnit, Mocha, Karma, and Cucumber. So languages that we used, Groovy. They wrote APIs in Groovy. Java, and Scala. So I also asked about environments, which were a massive issue. So I asked why they had so many environments when they were telling me about this, and they couldn't actually answer why there were so many environments. It was a pretty big mess. So we were transitioning the application from London to Leeds, so they were in a period of transition, which meant we'd be working with the London developers as well, who'd actually built the whole solution until the transition had completed. So it completed last December, but they'd been working on it for 6 months at this time. So basically it sounded like a pretty big mess, but as you guys probably are, you're kind of into that. A mess means that there's something interesting going on instead of just like, yay, I can actually deploy my software, which is what you want, but it's not as exciting. So I get in there, and it was actually worse than it sounded. So here's the general architecture of the system. Each color is a section of the architecture that's looked after by a component team. And we've got 2 stacks that aren't quite duplicates of each other, but they're pretty close. And the second stack's only missing like this kind of front-end proxy. It was kind of difficult trying to figure out what to call these things because they're really kind of convoluted systems, but yeah. So I was in the pink team, which wasn't called the pink team at all. It's called something completely different, but I need to call it something. So I was in the team that dealt with the front end of the system. So these dudes, the kind of Helios API proxy and the front end. And yeah. So both of these were written in Groovy. And we'd somehow managed to find Groovy developers, which is pretty rare. So these Groovy developers fucking loved Groovy. And when you suggested that maybe there was another option, they were really, really sad. They loved it. So what we had to deal with was a really clunky old front end written in Groovy with Grails and stuff like that, and a world of Siren JSON. So this was too long to actually put vertical, but this is a taste of Siren JSON. This is directly off the documentation. So it's Helios, and so it's directing the user where to go after each interaction. It's really, really difficult to navigate and try and write tests in. So when we looked into the tests, we discovered that the front-end application, there were no acceptance tests running as part of the build. Instead, they had functional tests. So this covered a lot of different layers. So when people say functional tests, you're going to encounter some issues because functional tests people use as a catch-all for everything, basically everything that's not unit testing on. They're like, oh, we'll cover that in functional tests. No, you won't. So they also had integration tests as well, which strangely were basically the functional tests. With instead of using a mock, they were actually testing against the real system. It was the same tests. So they were both written by the developers, and so they were just the same tests duplicated. So no one could actually agree what functional tests are, so which caused loads of arguments. So I'd recommend getting the naming of test layers sorted as quickly as possible if you're in a situation like this. So the same was happening for the API proxy layer. Loads and loads of these functional tests. Interestingly, there were absolutely no unit tests here either, as the development team had decided that writing unit tests weren't necessary, as they were writing these functional tests, which were better, and because they covered everything, so like unit tests, waste of time. What really happened here were there were slow-running, flaky tests, as you can imagine. So at the start of my time there, we had a lot of image changes, which is really boring. It should be really boring. And so the two front-end developers that we had were working on making really simple changes and checking in their work. So we had tests running on the build server here, but the issue was that these tests would take half an hour to run because they were like end-to-end and everything in between. And they were really flaky, so they'd fail. It would sometimes require 4 reruns to get the test to pass, even though the developers that they'd just changed it, knew that they'd just changed an image. So there wasn't anything really that was going to break. So tests that are flaky mean that people won't run them. It would have been really easy for the developers to actually exclude these tests, so it didn't take 2 hours to build a piece of software where they hadn't changed much. But the one person doing it means that everyone will want to do it, and then you won't have any tests running at all because we had no sensible tests. So this was really bad for the developers. But when I first looked into how we were going to release this software as a tester, it was looking even worse. So there were some UI layer tests that were written in the Thucydides over the top of JBehave. These are both BDD frameworks. So they'd layered a BDD framework on top of another BDD framework. And I have no fucking idea why you would choose to do that, because I couldn't really ask them. But it was really difficult to navigate around. And yeah, trying to pull them apart was really, really difficult. So I had a look in Jenkins to see what kind of stuff they had running as part of the CI. And these crazy Thucydides and JBehave tests hadn't been run in a year and a half. They were pretty much abandoned. So we had absolutely no idea of how the system was meant to actually work, as there were no unit tests and no working UI level tests. Changing things was pretty terrifying. The release system, we created an RPM, because it's Java, to the test environments, and then 2 testers spent 2 days manually testing the different components. Now, I'm really fucking lazy. My testers and I were having lunch one time and talking about how we were. One of the testers is really, really thorough, like really good to do your code reviews and stuff like that. And I'm cowboy as fuck. There's no way in hell I want to spend 2 days testing some really out-of-date piece of shit application. It's just not in my interest. So there are also some smoke tests which were written groovy, but they couldn't be run on the Jenkins box as someone had upgraded Firefox and not upgraded it in the tests. So these, of course, had to be run manually on your machine. And you had to ensure that you had the right version of Firefox, which was Firefox 35 or something. And there were only 13 of these tests, actually. So, as you can imagine, we had a test team that was totally champing at the bit to try and get some automation up and running, as they all had different opinions on how they wanted to do it. So, as testers, we generally write any language, but you're going to have your favorite. Everyone has their favorite language. So the mix that we had at the time was we had 2 Ruby testers, 2 C# testers, including me, one Java tester, and one Python tester. So everyone always thinks that their language is the best. As I said before, I think C#'s pretty badass. But yeah. But we really needed a framework that everyone would use, because writing frameworks in Java, and I mean, this is how we got into the whole situation in the first place. We had all these tests written in Groovy or Java or whatever. So Dale Carnegie says, throw down a challenge. So we needed to write these smoke tests, and the best way was to actually throw down a challenge. We'd write it in our different languages that we'd chosen and present it to the team. So we had a mix of Cucumber, Ruby, and Selenium, Gauge, Java, and Selenium, Cucumber, Java, and Selenium, and Cucumber, Python, and Selenium. So we gave everyone a week to do it in. This meant everyone had a really fair chance on building their framework and trying to make it as awesome as possible. Also, I've thought, now, you needed to show everyone else your work. And this is where it became really unfair. And I didn't think about it until it was actually happening at the time, so it was a bit too late to take any action on it. We didn't mention that part of building the framework meant that you had to show it to everyone else in the team at the end. And as I said, our team's huge. It's about 60 people. So that's testers, developers, scrum masters, and the ops team, etc. So the most competent tester, the tester that built the framework the best, as she's actually a developer now. She is a badass developer. She was writing it in a language, Python, that she really knew about as well. But she is really painfully shy, and she doesn't like getting up in front of people. So Python wasn't going to be chosen as the language because she had a really unfair disadvantage that she wouldn't be able to sell it. So when you set a challenge like this, make sure it's fair. Her option didn't really stand a chance because she was so painfully shy. So, another quote from Dale Carnegie: merely stating a truth is not enough. The truth has to be vivid, interesting, and dramatic. You have to use showmanship. The movies do it, television does it, and you have to do it too if you want some attention. So, back to the presentations. We showed our different frameworks and explained the benefits of each framework. If you haven't heard of Gauge, it's an open source tool to write test cases in. It's really similar to Cucumber, except you don't need to use the given, when, then pattern. Personally, I really don't like the given, when pattern, as I've never heard anyone speak like that in my life, so I don't see why I should have to write tests like that. No one speaks like that. So, talk in terms of the other person's interest. Gauge also has some really amazing reporting. And working with developers previously, I know that developers absolutely love the reporting in Gauge. Cucumber reports are really quite clunky, and so they're not as easy to follow as Gauge. This is a really nice UI. So I also knew that we had a bunch of JVM developers in the room, even if they focused on different languages like Groovy, Scala, or whatever instead of Java. And so writing a Java framework would most likely win them over. So I presented it, we all voted, and we chose Gauge and Java for the framework. Perhaps a little bit of showmanship, and as well as knowing what developers particularly liked in there helped. Or I just chose the right automation framework in the first place. So it ended up that we had the developers on board with what we were going to be using across the board to write the new framework in, which is important. Arouse in the other person an eager want. So it's funny. Testers seem to actually get to write a lot more code than developers, especially when you're backfilling test cases. We are writing so much code. So here we asked for help from the developers, and they assisted us with improving the test cases. We made our code way more fun to write than the developers' code. If you remember, they were doing image changes and shit like that. We were writing cool automation. So what this encouraged was cross-discipline pairing, which ended up building a really strong team and a pretty good framework. So by this point, we had the smoke tests written. But these were really the smallest of our worries. The smoke test didn't stop the testers from having to perform 2 days of testing for a product. The smoke test gave us pretty much diddly squat, really. as there was something, if I remember correctly, they did actually run, but they were a real easy part of the system to tackle. So the actual chunk of tests that were important here were the horrific J-behave serenity tests. Thesicities. They renamed it to serenity so people could actually say it. That weren't running. And they hadn't been running for a year and a half, but these were so hard to tackle and almost impossible. We had several people look at this, but to absolutely no avail, really. They were totally impenetrable in their messiness. So we decided to tackle something else in the meantime. So, also, fixing the UI tests weren't for the benefit of the entire team. There was only one team that actually had a UI. The rest of the team, so the proxy API and the API layer with the core system, wouldn't have benefited from the UI tests at all. We wouldn't have been able to share knowledge of how we were building the tests. So instead, we started on the API acceptance tests. But unfortunately, this wasn't done in the same manner of choosing the frameworks. So hopefully you can learn a few lessons from what I didn't do right here. So it was done as a bit more of a solo endeavor. And the problems from this are still really around. I'd written API tests before. I'd written them in C# using REST Sharp, which I really loved. It was a really great API library. Absolutely marvelous. So when I was looking for the equivalent in Java, some things just didn't really fit the same. I looked at a few different frameworks. So I looked at UniRest, and I looked at Rest Assured and the Apache HTTP client. So I totally disregarded the Apache HTTP client as it was way too raw for my needs. Testers, we're really not the strongest coders, and so we need fairly simple things to work with. And I disregarded Rest Assured because of my previous misconceptions. So it has the given when then layer. And as you know, I hate that. It seems really silly. But I could actually abstract this away in my code. So it wouldn't have made a difference in the end. However, I was really blinded by my hatred of the BDD language. And I was choosing this framework by myself. I was having chats outside with the other senior test engineer while I was smoking, but that didn't really help. So I chose UniRest, although I'd probably look at Rest Assured if I did this again, because apparently it's really, really awesome. And I think there's a little bit more documentation around. So, yeah. So don't choose technology as a solo. So also the problem here was that I was writing the API tests for a system that uses Siren JSON, which, as you can see, it's really, really complex. And trying to write DTOs for that is just painful and quite upsetting. So we use JSON path, which is kind of like XPath, but for JSON, where the other testers used JSON or Jackson because they had systems where they could actually write DTOs for them. All systems aren't the same. So this has caused all kinds of headaches. This here was pretty much our largest mistake with these frameworks, and we are definitely still paying for it. We're looking into JSON-IDA now to solve this, as we're basically going to need to write from scratch a new framework, of course swapping it out, not just like Big Bang, because that's silly and horrible. In regards to a deserializer, as you would be surprised at how attached people get to their different libraries. So, yeah, we'll need to replace it entirely. So, the only way to get the best out of an argument is to avoid it. So, we aren't going to solve this issue by people shouting each other down, by saying that JSON or Jackson is better. And in the end, who cares? So just start anew. Libraries move on and get better. Sell the new and don't dwindle on the old. So on the topic of JSON-IDA, the way we found out about this is through the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar. So one of our contractors spends an hour a month reviewing the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar to see what cool and new exciting tools have come about. So we use the Tech Radar for more than this, though. We've implemented the Tech Radar, so choices like this won't bite you. Any proposals for new tools, they come through the Tech Radar, which is looked at once a week by the entire development team. So what's really cool here is when we review pull requests that don't meet what's on the tech radar, we can reject them for this reason, therefore keep our code base clean. So I had an incident the other week where a tester was trying to pull in a new library which just didn't fit with everything, and instead of just being like, dude, you're wrong, don't do that, it's like, oh, well, it needs to be on the tech radar. It's how to work with people better as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, the front end of the system had almost no unit tests, which was causing very long build times as these functional tests were written instead of the unit tests. So, what's most surprising here is we had to actually train the developers how to write unit tests. So quite a few of the developers had never written unit tests before. And the idea of unit tests had to be sold to them, which I thought was fucking mental. I don't know, it's strange. But here, talk in terms of the other person's interest. So we had to discuss with the developers what a unit test was, and why it was a good idea to do it, why refactoring without unit tests is scary, and what guidelines we had for unit tests. Focusing on refactoring meant that the developers understood how doing this would help them, and it wouldn't just seem like a lot of extra work for little payoff. The front-end API was notoriously difficult to work in, as it was written in Groovy, as I mentioned, and therefore had loads of groovy magic. So touching one piece of code would change another dimension without you actually knowing. So they argued over what a unit was for ages as well. So I had to make what a unit was clear to them. So this is kind of what I told them. So unit tests should cover isolated bits of code. If code's inherited from another class, do not test that class in the inheritance. Component tests should cover this. See, I don't say functional tests there. Derived classes, we are just testing change code. So you remember at the start that we had functional tests and integration tests that were the same without mocks. Don't do that. So we had to do code reviews to include the inclusion of unit tests. It was quite a strange experience explaining unit tests to developers, but really worth it. So here, just don't assume that people understand everything, because you'll find that sometimes they won't. But sometimes due to cultural differences or that they're just shy, they won't actually pipe up and ask. So they might not actually understand unit tests, and I only found that out after a while because I didn't believe that anyone wouldn't. So, which brings us up to another section. So when I was messing around with this one component, there were some really massive problems going on in another team. So the API layer for the core system. So it's the yellow part here. So it's a really big piece of the system. It's where the logic should be kept and stuff like that, basically. So there were constant arguments in this team about two sets of tests. So the cucumber tests and the gauge tests. The developers in this team were actually pretty good. They had unit tests, so they were organized, in comparison to the team that I was from. So they also had integration tests, which was really cool, but it also became the problem. So what happened here was there was a bug found really late in a release of software. So two developers decided to work over the weekend and redo all of the gauge tests, which we call the acceptance tests. And while redoing all these tests, they merged them into the application code base, which meant that every change to the test bumped the version of the application with the way that we've got this sorted. So it also meant that the code base was larger and it was already a massive monolith, and that the developers had written the acceptance test for all their own work. On top of this, they said that the tester on their team was shit, and that they didn't need testers, especially one as shit as that. Now, don't get me wrong, you don't always need testers. I don't have a problem with people not needing testers, but the dynamic of the team meant that the rest of the team was constantly bulldozed into what one rockstar developer wanted, who would work on stuff all night if he could. So don't criticize, condemn, or complain. So this should go without saying, but don't say that someone else on your team is shit. Like, publicly to everyone and redo all their work. I'll repeat that. Don't say that someone else on your team is shit. It caused so many problems. So this tester refused to work in that team, and like so many developers refused to work in this team. I'm still dealing with the confidence issues of what this arsehole did to this tester, basically. So if you haven't seen Netflix talk on Brilliant Jerks, I'd really recommend watching it to get an idea of, you know, what kind of people shouldn't be on your team. So Brilliant Jerks can cause issues within a team, such as no one wanting to work with them. So it doesn't matter how good their work is, if no one will work with them, their work's absolutely useless, especially in an environment where pairing is key. So it was about this point that it was starting to become apparent that component teams weren't working. There were too many silos. So at this point, the other tester that was on that API core team had quit. And as I said, I had to move the other tester into a different team because he'd had such a bad confidence knock and he couldn't actually work with this dude or test his software. So because he was shouted at constantly as well. And so we had to move a contractor into this API core team. So by this point, I'd moved into a different team. So I'd moved into the proxy API team, which was the green one on there. And it was really interesting, as I was so far from this team that I had to learn how their entire system worked. People were in the same tribe working on pieces of software without knowing how another component that it interacted with worked at all. And it wasn't just the testers that had this problem, it was the developers as well. So the developers were writing different languages, and if someone was sitting over the other side of the office, there was a fair chance they hadn't even really spoken to them. And we also had a new head of tech join who wanted to make his mark, as they all do. And so we'd also had the other senior leave, and so I ended up being promoted to the test manager as I was the only one left to actually do that. So we came up with the idea of feature squads on an away day. When this new dude, head of tech, came in, he got us all to go away on an away day, and we worked together as a leadership team to work out how this could work. So Dale says, let the other person feel that the idea is his or hers. So we came back from the away day, and without any planning, one of the Scrum Masters presented the idea of feature squads, and it was a total fucking disaster. So this was beyond a disaster. There were pretty much riots at this point. The way it was presented was in a really overcomplicated diagram, which was this one, and everyone thought it was a ridiculous idea, especially because it was just forced on them, just like, hey dudes, we're doing this now, woo! So we set up working groups to discuss how we could implement it. So the working groups identified issues that could come from working in feature squads, and we came back together to see how we could present it to the team, actually prepared this time. So here Dale says, dramatize your ideas. And so here's seen the infomercial for Hello Nasty by the Beastie Boys. Okay. So I'm going to show you a clip of it. It's a work of art. It's really overdone and ridiculous and absolutely brilliant. So
the following program is a paid advertisement and expresses the opinions of the producers and not necessarily of this network. The Juice Ladies.
And we're back. Hi, I'm Peg. This is Viv.
Did you miss us?
And we're here with the
missed
super
you.
juicer today.
This is we had some trouble last week with the,
Little racy with raisins.
we had to rectify those raisins. We had to reduce. But
But
now,
everybody knows us because we have fun with fruit. You know what? Let's invite someone up here with us. They can share in this juice.
I think so.
Do we have a volunteer from the audience?
Me.
Sir, in the front row.
Actually,
So fun. Come right in here.
now how are you feeling
Join us
today?
right in here.
I'm okay.
What's your name, sir?
My name's John.
Oh, John.
John.
That's fun.
Yeah.
Why don't you give that a try? Go on, give it a try. It's fun.
Okay.
Wow.
Here, you can.
Now we
really
have,
good.
We have a surprise for you. You'll love this second.
Woo! Woo!
Now look
wild
what our second
man.
machine does. Go on, Viv. Show
You
us
are-
what the second machine
Now
does.
this machine is my favorite. What happens when we push this button
What happens?
is this.
Well, it's 50 cups of coffee and you know it's on. I move the crowd to the break of dawn. Keep walk for how it's out the party people. It's where we're getting down. We are all equal.
So, we were sitting there discussing how we were going to present the idea. Oh, sorry. And I asked the team to watch a snippet of this. So the thing with infomercials is they actually know how to sell something, even if it is a piece of shit. So how to appeal to your audience, there's a specific formula. And if you have to present something this important and is going to change the way that 60 people work, you have to make sure that you prepare and look into how it's actually going to appeal to them. So the structure I followed for this presentation was this. So statement of what the actual problem was. Proposal of the solution. I got some testimonials, so John in the Beastie Boys clip, he was like, oh my God, this is awesome. Concerns of the proposed solution and how the solution takes care of the concerns. And repetition of the solution. So infomercials, you need to repeat things to get people interested and thinking that it's a good idea. Repeat yourself. So everyone knew that I was using cheap selling techniques, but it made it fun and it made it interesting, and I actually listened to their ideas. So it ended up that everyone agreed to work in feature teams because we actually prepared ourselves to sell the idea this time. And by including people in the discussion, it helped them feel that the idea was actually theirs as well. So those working groups, we worked with them to see what their problems were, and I brought the ideas into that presentation as well. So by this point, we had people working across different components. We had people writing tests, and I was managing the testers, so I'd been able to start coaching them. So it was this point that we received the news that the bigwigs were coming up from London. So working at Sky, you have people that people are scared of. Like, oh my God, this person's coming up. Like, working at startups and stuff before, I haven't really had to give a shit about that before, but in really big organizations, it's weird. You actually seem to have to. So, I hadn't actually met them before, but word on the street was that they thought testing was an absolute fucking waste of time. They hated testing. They hated what it costed. So I had a pretty big sell on my time, on my hands. So Dale says, talk in terms of the other person's interest. So we were told that we'd have an hour with them. And with that, we had to present the technology strategy, the feature team strategy, and the testing strategy. I only did the testing strategy. So I work with a really awesome principal engineer who speaks as well, and he'd noted that what these higher-ups actually wanted, which could be found in their newsletters. So he based his technology strategy on that, which worked perfectly. Know what people want beforehand and sell them that. So Joe Swan knew what their interests were and based the technology strategy on that, and they absolutely loved it. They sucked it up. So I wasn't this lucky, of course, because they hated testing. So I had to do these things a little bit differently. So make the other person feel important and do it sincerely. So when the higher-ups were coming, I was actually pretty excited. I hadn't met them before, and, well, if you have people like this on your good side, it means that you can probably get funding for your projects. So this was a pretty good opportunity to make a good impression on them. So I brought cake. I brought cake, chocolates, biscuits, whatever. People fucking love cake. If you have a visitor, provide food. Make them feel welcome. And actually, like, you're excited to see them. I was, but cake really cemented that with them. So, smile. So, look at them in their eyes. Shake their hands, smile. They don't know you either, and yeah, they might get paid more, but it doesn't mean that they don't want to feel comfortable. They might actually be a bit scared. So smile and make them feel welcome. Maybe not like that. I have a tendency to do that a lot. I scare people, so try and not scare them. So remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. So there was only 3 people that I was actually presenting this to. And if you're presenting an idea to a small group of people, call them out by name. Say how wonderful it is to have them here, because it really is. They've taken time out of their schedule to come and see you. Make them feel welcome and make them feel like it was worth it. So, although these people really couldn't give a fuck about testing, they left that room really happy, and they listened to me because I made them feel important. And well, also I thought they were important because I actually took time out of their day. They came up from London to what everyone thinks is crappy little Leeds, but it's not. It's really awesome. So, on that, I'm going to show you the test strategy that I presented to them. And also, it's the test strategy that we use now to try and get people actually writing tests and stuff like that. So, hi. This is Identity's test strategy. So, first off, I'm going to start with the basic theory of why we test. Testing creates confidence that your product works, or perhaps the avoidance of doubt that your product will break. Sky should be a synonym for quality. We want to ensure that customers can log on to the platform at any time, whether it be to watch Friends at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday or to watch Game of Thrones at 9 p.m. on a Monday night. The Identity platform should always be available, frictionless, and secure for the customer. Via performance, load, security, and automated testing, we can create a Sky product that can be deployed quickly with known quality. Testing also ensures that we are delivering software of value. By aligning with the business on what scenarios are expected within the application, we can deliver a journey-driven solution which adds value to the product. But really, why test? A stable system isn't just for the customers. Working in a vague version of the Spotify model, it isn't only the ops team on call. Team members from all disciplines are on call. Creating a stable, tested piece of software means that your life is easier as a member of the Identity team, as you won't be the one getting woken up at 2 a.m. to keep the system up. So it's all very well and good wanting a system that is stable, with a minimal amount of show-stopping bugs, but how do we actually create a quality system? Identity want to look at the testing pyramid a little bit differently. We would like to reimagine the test pyramid instead as a bug filter. Only bugs unable to be found by the prior component of testing will be able to reach the next stage of testing. We will cover unit, component, integration, acceptance, end-to-end, and exploratory testing. In the future, I would like to align the bug filter to our continuous deployment solution. Unit testing will be the layer with the largest amount of tests. Having a large unit testing layer has quite a few benefits. Unit tests are quick to write and run, and they greatly assist when refactoring units of code. If code is written without unit tests, it's very difficult to go back and refactor that code, as the developer will be unable to see if refactoring has actually broken anything. A component test is a test that limits the scope of the exercise software to a portion of the system under test. Component tests will frequently include mocked or stubbed components so that the tested functionality can be isolated to the component that the developer is interested in testing. Integration tests cover multiple components and will find issues between multiple components speaking to each other. Acceptance tests will be written to the acceptance criteria on a card and written in clear language that can be reused for business documentation for specific areas of functionality. And end-to-end tests cover user journeys. That will be the journeys that customers are actually making through the product. Exploratory testing will only catch the most subtle bugs that haven't been able to be caught via automation. Next, I will be showing how we are planning to make the Identity Tribe excellent through support and learning. Part of the purpose of these tests are also documentation around the application. The tests create many opportunities for learning, especially sharing knowledge across disciplines. Learning also brings us together and builds better bonds within the team. With strengthened communication, we should be able to work in a more cohesive manner to deliver more cohesive software. Developers and testers pair across the tribe, which promotes cross-learning. the developers learn more about testing, and testers learn more about development. This also improves quality across the product, as 2 heads on each part of the process is way better than 1. Pairing also allows the sharing of technical knowledge and the development of shared techniques. More consistent code helps remove the mental barrier to exploring a previously written test, allowing the observer to focus on the testing element. Through the Testing Guild, we will be building up a mentoring relationship with the testers. We want to encourage the testers to grow in the right direction. And within Identity, we have many fantastic directions they can go in. With our team interested in their work, we will be able to deliver better software. So we've started chapterships within the tribe in Identity where we're bringing all the testers, the Scrum Masters, and the developers together in their retrospective specialisms to share knowledge and discuss common issues and solve them together as a team. Joe Swan has implemented Fat Fridays where the tribe can work together to solve pressing issues that have occurred during the team. During the Fat Friday times, we've solved pressing issues like building off branches, Dockerizing some of the applications, and working on test frameworks. This is also a great place for the team to learn together. So while mentoring the testing team members, we can focus on where the individual is at the moment and where they want to be. If they're interested in security testing, we can pair them with someone in the tribe who has knowledge and recommend some courses for them, for example. We want our team members to be constantly learning and not only be proud of where they work, but to be proud of where they work. So, what I did there was I created a new model to show them. People have seen the testing pyramid. They are so sick of the testing pyramid. If you show them something different, you actually capture their interest. So they were really interested there. And I talked about how I wanted the best for Identity and stuff like that. So yeah, if you want to use the testing cone, have a chat with me. And like if you didn't take a photo, and you can have it. So I just want to say thank you. It's really cool talking about testing at a development conference. It makes me really happy, and getting to go to my first development conference. So, any questions? Hi.
So I work in a team that is relatively happy with like unit testing and component testing, and it's very fluent with that language.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as you start trying to bring in the vocab of sort of tribes and guilds and pairing and that sort of thing, there's a real cringe factor.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering the extent to which you had that, especially with your more experienced devs, and how you overcame that.
So we didn't have a problem with pairing, actually, because the London team really encouraged it. And so we had a lot of the team kind of looking up to the London team. I'm not sure why, but... and so we've only got one problem with one of the developers pretty much refusing to pair, but that's because they have anxiety issues and you need to work around that. So what you do is you make it exciting, so especially with the automation framework, because and you make it so that they will it'll be in the language that they're interested in and stuff like that. Also so we've got the front-end developer who works in JavaScript, which no one else really does. So he did demos on Fat Friday showing what his language was, and how you could write unit tests in it and stuff like that. And if people are doing new stuff and it's like, hey, this person's working on this, does anyone want to work with me? That might work. Does that sound okay? Yeah?
How about the other stuff, like bringing in tribes and guilds and chapters and that sort of thing?
I found it really difficult to get the tester guild started. Because everyone's always got something else more important to do. That's always kind of the attitude. So what we did was, so for the developer one, we brought in the tech radar review. And basically, if you don't go to the guild, then you won't be able to review the tech radar and have a say in technology. So make it important. Also, what was the most important thing with the guilds was, so me as the test manager, I don't run the guild because it's not my guild, it's the testers guild. And so what we do is every month we have a different person run the guild, and they come up with the ideas and stuff like that. So it's not me dictating to people what they should be interested in. It's the testing team and they come up with what they want to talk about and stuff like that. I can't recommend doing that enough.
Say, like the testers are in the guild. Do you have developers who are interested in unit testing within the guild?
So we've got the testers and the developers in different guilds, but we talk. So Fat Fridays, we all hang out and talk about stuff, and you can show people stuff on Fat Fridays, like do presentations about stuff. I think the unit testing one was one that I did in a Fat Friday. But we have spoken about so us joining together for one if we've got something that we all want to talk about. I think we will be doing that in the future, although we haven't yet, because testing guild's only been going properly since November, because I had a few false starts until I got the testers to actually lead it. Yeah. Cool. Hi.
You said you don't like the given and then scenarios.
Yeah.
So how did you express your scenarios in your acceptance test?
So So, like this, in kind of natural language. So, create profile and it returns a response, and then sign in, stuff like that. So, yeah, just in normal language, how you'd kind of say it. So that's just an example that I've got there. Yeah. Any other questions? Sorry? So it does, because we're moving in between all the different teams, so we've got all the different feature squads, and so if you want to know how this part of the system, like the bridge works, God, you really need to read through this. It is a really complex system, so it really helps with how stuff actually works. Otherwise, it would be so hard to understand as a new starter. Yeah.
Yeah, but surely if you would have a function that says, I don't know, login user, create profile function, and a method that says return unexpected valid status and user got signed in, you can read through the tests without the.
So we did have that for the groovy ones, and it made it really complex. So with testers, make it as easy as possible. We're not coders, and also I can export this. So if the product owner wants, to know how this works, I can just give it to them. Also, I work with an Italian and a German team, and they don't have any automation, and they're like, can you provide evidence that you've tested this? I'm like, here's the spec file, please go away and write some automation instead of asking me questions. Yeah. Any other questions? Hi?
We've got quite a few manual testers. Did you have the same issue where you had more workload for automated the manual after this transition?
We were really lucky in that they hired all automation testers. So all of us could code to differing degrees. None of us wrote Java, we had to learn. But yeah, so with the release of the horrible front end stuff, we were still having to do manual testing and trying to write automation in the meantime. So we had so much automation to catch up on, but with the developers pairing with us, it made it easier. So also developers would actually write automation if they had time, because we made it fun to write. So yeah, does that answer it properly? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I don't really check the metrics, because otherwise people get really focused on the metrics. So we do exploratory testing around, so every card that comes through, because we've mostly got APIs, and so everything that comes through, we do the automation around it. So yeah, is there manual testing for the front end application still? Yeah.
So there's some things you wouldn't automate as well.
Yeah.
You know, niche error scenarios or trying to set the system into an error state. You might not, but there might be value in having that
Yeah.
automated. So you could try and trigger interesting scenarios
Yeah.
manually and then automate the paths through the system,
Yeah.
which are most meaningful for customers.
But it's mostly just poking, like exploratory, like all of this is kind of covered. Yeah. And we did this in a year for a pretty complex system. Any other questions? Cool. Oh, hi.
Do you test driven development at all?
So with some of the developers not understanding unit testing, no. So we're getting there with it. So yeah, some of the developers do, and it is good to pair the ones that don't understand this kind of stuff with those developers so they can learn how to do it. But developers make a lot of excuses why they don't want to do test-driven development. I found over the time. So yeah, just little bits, but not as much as we should.
We use it to sort of justify any line of code that you're writing a test.
Yeah.
You have full confidence as a developer. You're like, I've done this, I know that it works.
Yeah.
In isolation.
Yeah.
Integrate with all their
Yeah.
like that.
You.
It really helps.
Yeah.
But it does destroy your velocity completely. Like,
But then you know that you're.
it's long to do, but it's still nice that when it's done, you can say, I'm high confidence that this works. That fancy line of code will work.
Yeah.
Tested.
It is really difficult.
Developers involved in the testing, because we have separate testing teams as well, and they're constantly tests. And
Yeah.
we're working with them, and we'll unit tested this, but then we do have the implementation with them, right?
Yeah.
Automated tests that duplicate some of the unit stuff. At least they get kind of double coverage.
That's cool. Yeah. That sounds nice. Like, especially that you get to pair with them. Yeah. Cool. Okay, thank you so much. It's really nice to talk about testing at a dev conference.